Good evening and welcome to CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Homanoff, producer and host of the program, and thank you for joining us. Our guest this evening is Will Richmond, the editor and publisher of VideoNuze's.com. And Will is one of the pioneers probably in the entire field of following online video and was into online video before it was cool. And I'm very pleased to have him join us this evening. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Howard.
And why don't I plunge boldly into the present first and ask, are you surprised at all that in a world, sometimes when you read the popular press, it's as if television already, our traditional notion of it is already dead and we're now in a bold new future. Are you surprised at all in some sense about the resilience of what we used to call the television business and its ability to sort of hang on?
I'm not that surprised, actually, because I think the quality of TV today is better than it's ever been. So certainly that's been, I think, a big advantage for TV's durability, is that the quality of the programming across both the broadcast and the cable dial is better than it's ever been. And in addition to that, access to that programming is better than it's ever been. And when I say access, I mean the idea that 15, 20 years ago, the only way that you could catch a show was if you literally sat down, appointment viewing at a particular time and watched it. Today, that's of course still possible, that model of linear traditional viewing, but now you can watch TV shows on video on demand. You can watch them through your DVR. You can watch them through various streaming services. So the convenience factor of being able to watch TV shows is a lot higher today than it's ever been.
And, it reminds me a little bit of the early days of the VCR, when the motion picture business especially fought all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to stop the VCR. That's, this'll end the theatrical movie business. It turned out that, in fact, it ended up being, some would say, maybe the savior of it, and certainly for many decades to come. Is this a bit of that replay, that it turned out that having so many other options besides watching it live actually enhances the overall business if you're in that, quote, television business?
Sure. Well, technology change is scary to a lot of people, and for good reason, because technology change can be very disruptive and it can also augment existing businesses. And nobody really knows for sure what it's going to do until it starts taking hold. So I think there is an analogy there to the VCR in the sense that the TV industry, part of the reason it's healthier today than it's ever been, again, is because of the vibrancy of technology and how that's driven changes in consumer behaviors to be able to consume TV in lots and lots of different ways.
So that, again, and probably people in it don't even like the use of the word traditional, but I'll keep using sort of the multi-channel video universe, another way to think about it. But what does the future look like? We've sort of seen a present in a way better than maybe some expected or are recognizing, acknowledging. But is it one of these, does it look like this for a while to come? Are you looking towards the famous tipping point at some, 2016, sort of mid-May? What's your, how do you look at that?
I think you can think of TV in sort of three eras, if you will. The first era was the idea of a few broadcast networks, and at some point those broadcast networks were picked up and distributed by early cable system operators. But there was kind of an era of broadcast. Then what we saw with the advent of satellite delivery was the development and proliferation of cable, quote-unquote, cable TV networks, of which there are now literally hundreds, of course. And that's been the way the world has pretty much worked over the last 30 years or so, is that more and more Americans have been subscribing to pay TV. It's now somewhere around 90%, give or take, penetration rate here in the US. Now I think what's happening is we're sort of entering the third era, which is that just as cable networks took advantage of more and more spectrum or delivery capability by cable operators, what we now see happening are that there are online video content creators who are taking advantage of the new internet delivery system, the IP pipes, if you will. And so we're now in that third era, I think, just at still the very beginning stage of that. And inevitably what ends up happening, I think, is that just as cable networks and the proliferation of them fragmented audiences away from broadcast networks, so whereas broadcast networks used to have 90–95% penetration of all audiences, now they're actually below 50% in prime time. the advent of all these online video networks will further fragment audiences. And look no further than your average Netflix subscriber. And what are they doing during prime time? Are they necessarily turning on to a broadcast network program or a cable TV network program? Or are they going over to Netflix to watch something just as easily as they might have done the former two behaviors? And I think that's the kind of fragmentation that we're now seeing.
So given that fragmentation, which is going on, will only continue and likely accelerate and expand, however you want to visualize it, what do you make of the situation sort of today and going forward for the companies that have been traditionally the big players? So it's the big MSOs, the big multi-channel distributors, and the big vertically integrated, in the case of Comcast, I suppose they're part of the same, but but the companies that are also the big vertically integrated content companies and providing a variety of networks. Where do they, as companies, not just as a broad business, fit, and what does it look like from your perspective for them?
Well, it's a time of, I think, both opportunity and challenge for both. And let me talk about the operators first, and I'll talk about the programmers. So for the operators, many of them on the cable side are now among the biggest broadband ISPs in the country as well. So they're not only delivering you a package of video channels, but TV channels, but also they're providing the underlying broadband internet access. And that's a very profitable, very high margin business for them. And certainly as their subscribers are accessing more high bit rate content, video primarily, and demand better and better broadband service that of course costs more per month, that's a good thing for those operators. So they're, if you will, kind of hedging their bets. They have a foot in both camps, the traditional TV world, which of course still provides pay TV subscriptions a large part of their top line revenue, but an increasingly smaller part of their margin, their actual profit. And on the broadband side, smaller in terms of top line revenue, but larger in terms of their profitability. So the operators are kind of getting the best of both worlds, because even if there is massive cord cutting that happens sometime in the future, they're going to kind of make up a lot of that in the broadband side. The programmers are in a different situation. They have been kind of riding a very significant wave over the last 20, 30 years or so forth, steadily raising rates.
It's good to be the king, right?
It's good to be the king. Well, they've...
if you believe Sumner Redstone and content is king, then...
the reality is that they have had the equivalent of beachfront real estate, right? There's been a finite amount of channel capacity and finite capacity of operators willing to pay a monthly fee. So if you are MTV and you basically then own the music space on the dial, or you were CNN and you were originally the only news, 24-hour news channel, now you're one of just still a handful, or any one of a number of other kind of genre-based channels, you had the equivalent of beachfront real estate, and that's been a very, very good business to be in. What's changing now, of course, is that as viewers fragment their behaviors and their viewership patterns, that value of that beachfront real estate is actually declining, because now it's not just what's available in that cable world that viewers are able to access, but what's also available over here in the IP world. So think about an example where maybe you have a family with a couple of young kids. In the past, the option for the kids to watch programming would have probably been things like Disney Channel or Nickelodeon or maybe PBS Kids, things like that. Conversely now, there's a range of kids programming available online on services like Netflix and others. And of course, with the availability of this content on multiple devices, kids are, even the youngest kids, 3, 4 years old, are able to now take advantage of watching just the programs that they want to watch. It's all within their control. And of course, that again sort of diminishes the value of being in that beachfront property. It says that it's still valuable, but just not quite as valuable. How that all plays out over the course of the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years remains to be seen, but I think it's, if history is any sort of precedent, I think it's only fair to assume that the value of those franchises will inevitably decline by some amount, just because there's now more choice, and inevitably consumer dollars for subscriptions and also advertiser dollars to support the programming will be diffused over more choices.
So is the, and in the programming world itself, you've also sort of got two bits. You've got pieces, sometimes they're the same company, but the people producing it and sort of the networks carrying it, right? So I've often wondered if, the program, and we talk about great programs, right? Before we we came in here, we're chatting about our favorite shows, and everybody now, whether it's Game of Thrones or The Americans or Justified, or go down the list, right, of all the terrific programming kind of in this renaissance. What about the networks? What about being the guy that if you aren't the owner of the content itself, are you sitting in a much more vulnerable spot if really you're just, I wouldn't say repurposing necessarily, but you're the sort of vehicle for somebody else's program?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the world that I was just describing.
Yeah,
the networks that don't necessarily own their own content, even if they do own their own content, they're fighting for eyeballs more than they ever have in the past. And so they're going to be challenged to kind of hang on to those folks. And to be fair, the pay TV industry is doing a lot of things around TV everywhere to try to enhance, again, the convenience of being able to access programs, to put more value into the monthly subscription, which of course is getting more and more expensive every year. The number one complaint that everyone has about pay TV is not necessarily the value isn't there, but that the price is just getting higher and higher and higher. And for a lot of Americans, it's difficult to justify that type of a monthly outlay, especially as there are cheaper alternatives online. And then just to address the second part of your question about the underlying producers, the studios and the others that actually create the programming themselves, this is a real big opportunity for them, because to the extent that there are now other networks that want to procure programming to drive their businesses, whether it's Netflix or Hulu or Amazon or Crackle, or the list goes on, and you have a track record as a producer who's able to drive big audiences and drive franchises, you're going to be in demand. And I think we've seen that now with lots of different producers that have made some of the online programming that's become very popular, whether it's House of Cards or Orange is the New Black or others like that. You see folks that have succeeded in the TV world now finding a lot of success in online as well.
Yeah. But so you, in the course of what we've been talking about, you're mentioning the consumer and their changing behavior. And you, in your own business, have really dedicated a lot of your focus now, especially towards the research and sort of the almost institutionalization of a lot of the research about this business. Talk a bit about what that research and there's a lot of it, okay? But in terms of the changing consumer behavior, what's it telling us, and does it suggest a future where where people just simply by generationally things change dramatically, or kind of where do you see the kind of dominant changes in consumer behavior?
Sure. Well, I think that the top line is that viewers and consumers in general have a love affair with technology right now. And you don't need to look any further than the local Apple store and the sort of buzz of energy that's going on in there to recognize that. You think about the fact that pretty soon 500 million iPhones will have been sold, 230 million iPads have been sold, and this, by the way, is through a time of relative economic uncertainty, and yet consumers are basically laying out for these still relatively high-priced gadgets, and that goes all the way down through, the teenagers that are holding, iPhones now that are relatively expensive for parents to fund, but do so anyway. So you have to start with the fact that consumers really are embracing technology in a big way, and that in turn is driving a lot of what we're seeing in the TV and the video business.
And let me not to interrupt, but about in terms of the consumers embracing technology, is it dramatically different among younger people than the 25 to 54-year-old demo? Never mind, my parents.
Well, there's no question that the younger generation, millennials, embrace and use technology as part of their lifestyles a lot more aggressively than do people that are older than that. They're the so-called digital natives. They're the ones that grew up starting from age 3, 4, 10, whatever, maybe on a computer initially, then on an iPad, maybe on an iPhone. They live in a screen agnostic world, if you will. They expect all programming to be available on all screens whenever they choose to be able to watch something. So certainly, to your point, as time marches forward and those generations get older and new generations come up behind them that are even more digitally native, there's no question that these kind of impacts will flow through the industry. But when you think about some more specific data points, there are now any number of video websites, whether it's sites like Vivo, which is a big music video site, very millennial oriented, younger oriented. PBS Digital, others like that, YouTube, that are now publicly reporting that anywhere between 30, 40, 50, 60% of their overall video views are coming through mobile devices. So the idea that there, not that long ago, was a paradigm of a website, and that you opened your computer, you went to a browser, and that's how you consumed content. For a lot of people, that paradigm is very quickly melting away, and they're living in a mobile device world driven primarily by apps, not by the web as we've known it for the last 15, 20 years, but more in an app type of world. And so smart content providers are responding to that by ramping up their mobile initiatives.
Yeah. What about, I don't know who first coined the term when it came to the new video universe of over the top, right? But it's thrown around now all the time, and it means some sort of different things to different people. Let's talk a bit about the shape of that world today, and then we can talk about the future. Let's start. We've obviously mentioned it. You can't not mention it. Netflix. Yeah. Is Netflix utterly dominant in that world from your perspective? Are they have 30 million subscribers, I think, now, which makes them bigger in terms of a subscriber number, right?
48 million, actually.
48 million. So there we are. We're actually, I taped this 6 months ago. And so anyway, so 48 million. Where is Netflix in this universe today in terms of their dominance? And is that a dominance they can maintain the way, in television 2.0, MSOs and big studios maintained power for decades?
Yeah. Let me talk about Netflix in a second, but let me just first address your question about over the top.
Yep. Okay.
And really, I think to understand it is to have to understand how truly disruptive broadband internet access is, because it wasn't that long ago in the pre-broadband age where if you wanted to deliver video to an audience, you had to work through, as a producer, you had to work through a network, a broadcast network, a cable network. They in turn had to work through a broadcast station or a cable TV operator, get a license, get a carriage deal, et cetera. We now live in a world, thanks to broadband, where you as a producer have immediate access to your audience. Now, you may choose to augment that by distributing through a Netflix or a YouTube or whoever, but that ability to have a direct connection with your audience is the fundamental disruption of this broadband era that we now live in. And what we've now seen is a number of different companies be able to take advantage of that. And so to your second question.
Before we get to the Netflix, though, so that's in it, but you're raising now, and we're now about 15 minutes in, and I'm going to raise the dreaded net neutrality word, okay? So what's your take in terms of net neutrality? And the fear of net neutrality advocates is exactly what you just have highlighted as this great promise of breaking down those barriers, and you don't have to go through carriage deals and stay up all night and negotiate, in Philadelphia and in Denver. You can actually get your content out there.
Right.
Is net neutrality, and we don't know where the FCC is going to come out, but at least as you hear about it, understand it, is that if we don't do something that looks like what the net neutrality advocates seek, is that threatened?
Net neutrality is an extremely complicated and very misunderstood concept.
We'll be doing a whole series on that, so we'll have you back for our net neutrality series.
It may well deserve an entire series, and even then it may not be perfectly understood. I think that most everybody would agree that the internet has thrived to date, the 20-year history, give or take, of the internet since it sort of burst on the scenes in the early to mid-90s, has thrived as a result of there not being any impediments between the user and the content provider, the e-commerce provider, whoever it is. That ability to directly connect without there being any gatekeeper in the way is really the fundamental building block of the innovation that we've seen in the internet space. And I don't think there's anybody that's really motivated to break that flow. That flow is very important for lots of different companies, including the broadband ISPs, who you would say in theory could gain from becoming more of a gatekeeper. Right. I don't, and therefore the requirement for a strong net neutrality. I don't think it's quite that clear. I think that the ISPs understand that to the extent consumers are watching more online video, that is a key driver for their broadband ISP business. And I think it's been that way. They understand that dynamic.
Which, as you point out, is really the huge source of profit.
Huge source of profit for these companies. They don't want to do anything to disrupt that. Not to mention there'd be a huge PR backlash if they started trying to do that. So I don't know that there's a problem today that requires the degree of government intervention that a lot of people propose. That said, if there were to be any indicators of misbehavior by broadband ISPs, the internet and broadband are so fundamental to our economy and to our free speech now that needing to have a quick reaction would be very important. Having said that, there are various deals that have happened, an interconnect deal between Netflix and Comcast, which a lot of people interpreted as the beginnings of a gatekeeper type of role. That's not the way that I interpreted it. I interpreted it as Netflix wanting to go with a direct connection rather than working through a traditional content delivery network, or CDN, which is what 99% of all other content providers do. But Netflix, back to a question that you asked a little while ago, is its own animal. They are by far the largest. They account for, by some studies, 30 to 40% of all online, all internet bandwidth during prime time these days. They operate under their own set of economics today, and they believe that having that interconnect was important. They've done other deals like that. So they sort of operate in their own world. Will they be able to sustain that place? That's an open question. There's a ton of innovation happening. We've come through, this is the tail end of what's known as the new fronts here in New York, where a lot of different, both online and traditional media companies have been presenting slates of original online video programming. A lot of it is really interesting, good stuff that no doubt, as I was talking about earlier, is going to further fragment audiences, drawing people away not only from broadcast and cable networks, but also from established over-the-top providers, whether it's Netflix or others. So it's an extremely dynamic landscape that we're in right now with video. There's a ton of investment going in, there's a ton of innovation, and a lot of it is really driven by the fact that billions of dollars of consumer subscriptions and advertising is essentially up for grabs right now, and that's the jockeying that we see.
What about some of the, there's almost a major announcement every week about
every day,
every day, right? I mean, which is, and I'm thinking now about, it's Dish and Disney, right? Dish has licensed the rights to Disney content that's going to be on now. Dish's new over-the-top service. We see AT&T and longtime Hollywood producer Peter Chernin are getting into business together. Amazon Fire, et cetera, right? And this is you live and breathe this every day and every night. Are these how much fire do you sense in this as opposed to smoke, right? I mean, the vaporware, that we've lived with and often in the internet world for the last 15 years. How much or what do you see if you can pick through from some of this and separate wheat from chaff? What amongst those announcements do you feel sort of most excited about in terms of the disruptive potential, the innovation that at least again, we're at an announcement stage, but that you see?
Well, you just called out a number of different deals, and there are still many other deals
more.
in addition to those that are out there right now. Generally speaking, I like deals that don't start from a clean piece of paper, but rather leverage on existing behaviors, existing content, existing franchises out there. So I'll give you one example that I think was really interesting recently, which is that Amazon has licensed a library of content from HBO. Now, it's not a substitute for dropping your HBO subscription. Shouldn't be confused with that. However, it is a way for HBO to access audiences that it maybe has not been able to access in the past. And Amazon, of course, is a massive distributor, has huge, hundreds of millions of consumer relationships, and can add value to the HBO franchise, help drive their bottom line. The deal is worth reportedly in the $300 million range. That's the kind of deal that I think is exciting because it brings more value to all the different parties that are touched by that, including, importantly, the consumer. So people who are maybe not able to afford a $15 or $18 a month HBO subscription now get access to a lot of the programming that's valuable. So those are the deals that are most exciting to me.
Right. One of the things I want to ask you about is the technological infrastructure to continue to have this easily available, or successfully available, maybe I'd call it. That people who, as Amazon is at 48 million, when it gets to if it gets to 75 and,
Right.
and Amazon Fire is at 20 million, and you have just the usage is so dramatically increased.
Yeah.
What's your take on our infrastructure, especially sitting in a place that lived through Hurricane Sandy? What's the technological infrastructure issues and our capability to handle all of this?
I think there are absolutely no infrastructure issues at all, actually. I think that I started in the broadband business about 20 years ago when we were just still dealing with
What did we call it before broadband? What was
slow band? I don't know,
slow
dial-up?
No, but what was broadband at the beginning? Just a terminology issue.
Was considered,
yeah.
Well, let's go back 20 years,
Yeah.
and some of our viewers may remember the days of dial-up access to AOL. Remember those screechy noises that give you a headache. And the idea of broadband, the faster connection, the always-on connection, not needing to dial up to initiate a session, but knowing that the internet's always there, is a huge breakthrough. And we saw speeds initially of 1.5 megabit per second in the early days of broadband rollouts. This was 20 years ago. We now routinely have people getting access at 25 megabit, 50 megabit, 100 megabit. And I think all of that is due to the fact that the broadband ISPs, who have basically funded the investment, hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure in this country to be able to support the types of internet usage and demand levels that we have today, have invested in order to meet those requirements. And that's, I think, something that we will continue to see because it's good business for those broadband ISPs and it's good business for the companies that are benefiting from that, and it's also a great benefit to the subscriber, to the end user as well. So I don't worry about the bandwidth. In addition to the bandwidth, there are a whole host of innovations happening that help to get content from point A to point B that have nothing to do with bandwidth, that deal with other sort of technology elements in the value chain, all of which are also undergoing a rapid period of innovation. So that's one thing there's, I think, absolutely nothing to be concerned with, that we're going to somehow hit the wall and run out of bandwidth. That's not. I mean,
because I think there's some maybe a popular misconception around that. So one of the things we haven't yet touched on, you talked about new fronts. One of the big funding elements of that has to be the advertising business, right? Give me your quick take on the online advertising business, which seems to take forever to get there. What's it look like today, and where do you see that going?
Quick take is it's still early days, but there's tons of advertiser interest, and the content sites are working double time and overtime to try to make the case and put the right mechanisms, including things like measurement and others, into place in order to bring the media buyers over. And I think all of that is just a process of time.
Great. Will, I want to dive a little deeper into the online advertising world, and it's one that you write about all the time. At the end of the day, the advertisers have money that they need to spend in marketing to get their products out there and bought. Talk about some of the most interesting innovations that you've seen in online advertising, companies, products, services that kind of are going to facilitate that more successful and prominent online video advertising business.
Sure, and first the preface is that the billions of online video streams that are consumed these days, the vast majority of them are free and ad supported. So for those content providers, it's essential that the advertising business and the advertising market mature and kind of catch up with their production ideals. So aside from Netflix and others like that that are paid services. But there's a lot of innovation happening in online video advertising, which in a sense sort of picks up on what's been happening in TV. So there's obviously a very established TV advertising business, about $70 billion here in the US alone. The online video advertising business is still small by comparison, maybe $4 billion, $5 billion a year, give or take, depending on whose estimates you believe. But what we've seen with online video advertising is an emphasis on both efficiency and also on adding value to the ad itself. So on the efficiency side, what we've seen is a big trend towards something known as programmatic. And programmatic is basically a catch-all term for using technology to advance the buy-sell proposition. So there's a whole host of workflow issues that are impacted by programmatic, but then there's also, on more of the front end, an improved kind of matching process between what the advertiser is looking for and their willingness to pay up to a certain amount for content that they want to run their ads against. So programmatic has been a huge innovation, both on the workflow side and also on the buy-sell. And what we've also seen, I think, is an improvement in the ability to target by using very granular data to specifically, for advertisers, to specifically find audiences that they want to advertise against. And that's, I think, at this point, more robust than what we've seen in the traditional TV advertising world. So those are some of the reasons why a lot of media buyers are very enthusiastic about online video advertising right now.
And how about, just the other day, Bob Liudis, who heads the Association of National Advertisers, talked about needing to have a governing authority around media measurement. It's been one of the complaints from agencies, sort of everybody, if everybody can be characterized, and in the frustration at not having a common media measurement. Where do you think that sits? And what do you think the prospects are to bring a much more kind of common currency to it?
Yeah, measurement has been the big stumbling block for online video advertising. There's obviously a very well understood currency in TV advertising. We have not yet had that develop in the online video world. There's been a lot of initiatives by Nielsen, also ComScore, to try to sort of normalize viewership between online video and TV. We're still very much in the first inning, I think, of those initiatives. So there are certainly media buyers that are kind of holding back until those initiatives are better baked. And I think, to the industry's credit, they're putting a lot of investment into trying to make that happen. Everyone recognizes what those challenges are, trying to move the industry forward.
Yeah. So I'm going to close with this question. You're not a VC, you're not an investment advisor, but play one for a minute.
Okay.
And if I'm trying to bet the online video world, and if I'm smart, I'm gonna spread it around a little bit. I'm probably not putting all my chips in any one place. But what kinds of segments of it do you get? Are you sort of most excited about moving forward in terms of, is it the big play is content and all the opportunities of studios? Is the big play again being the broadband ISPs, a bunch of small tech companies that are going to innovate? What's your sense of it as a looking at it as an investor?
Well, far be it from me to offer any investment advice. So let me
and we'll put the SEC disclaimer on that this is not the offer to purchase securities.
Exactly. Let me put that caveat up front. And I'm not sure my personal investment record would be anything to hold up as a litmus. But I think there are probably a couple of areas that are going to have sustained and increased demand going forward. First is on the delivery side. So I think every sort of data point and trend tells us right now that people are going to be consuming more and more video going forward. So anybody who's involved with that part of the business, whether it's a broadband ISP, a content delivery network, an encoding company, companies that are in the business of getting bits from point A to point B, are, I think, going to have a pretty good time of it going forward. Now, that's not to suggest there are other dynamics at work in those areas of the industry, but I do think that those are good places to be. And the other, I think, is on the monetization side specifically. So there are a set of advertising technologies and companies that are doing a lot of, I think, very interesting things right now that should only become more important to the industry going forward, assuming, again, that more and more viewership migrates over, advertising becomes a key part. You mentioned the content companies. I think that those are less certain from an investment perspective because they're more hit or miss. But there will certainly be winners. Netflix is a great example where they've now invested in original content and seem to be doing pretty well at it. So, so there are a lot of different sectors within the broader video industry right now.
All right. Well, Will, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us here at Media Reporter. I'm Howard Homanoff. Good night.